Hi, and welcome to the Reenactors Corner. In this episode, we'll talk about my favorite topic, which is food in the field, as well as Coca Cola. And we're also going to touch on how to deep fry food in the field.
Hey everybody, this is Chris here with Lassa, and we are going to have a really exciting episode today where we are going to talk about something that is important, very important to me, and I think important to every human being on Earth, and that is food. We're going to talk about rations in the context of World War II reenacting, ideas for things that you can eat, things that you should eat, things that you shouldn't eat, and I think we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, well, for my part, I always bring Snickers to events.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, McDonald's is the standard thing that everybody should be eating, but not everybody has access to a McDonald's all the time. So we're gonna talk about things that you can bring if you have to.
Yeah, how to make fries yourself in the field.
I would love to see that done.
We're actually discussing that at the last event we had, that we should try to actually make fries in the field. Because all you need is to fill the mess tin with oil, make it boil, and then just lower some cut up potatoes down into it.
It could easily be done.
It has to be tried for the fun of it.
Yeah, we used to have a field kitchen in my old group, and I often thought, what if we could make a situation where the cook could stick his ladle into the big giant steaming kettle of the field kitchen and bring out like a taco each time, would be something fun. So
you gotta be hungry.
Yeah, well, I haven't had anything to eat yet today. I might have some tacos in my future. But before we start talking in a more serious way about rations, we should talk about what we've been doing since we recorded the last podcast. So Lassa, you were saying before we started recording, you guys did an event last weekend?
Yeah, we did actually the first fully Norwegian tactical ever to be done.
That's really cool.
It's certainly a major breakthrough. What happened is that this has been like a year in the planning and everything like that. But there's this Norwegian group. I can post a link to their Facebook page or webpage down in the description, because they do reenact pre-war Norwegian army. So we basically had an invasion of Norway scenario where the Germans were pushing back the Norwegians. And it was really fun. Like, we weren't too many people. The Norwegian were 6-ish people, and we were 10-ish. It's also kind of the problem that we are a late war group, and the invasion of Norway happened in 1940. So we kind of had the wrong kit, because none of us really have enough early war kit. But in my opinion, it's better to actually go out and reenact with your fellow units than it is to necessarily have the correct boots in, just for this one event.
I totally agree.
And then we had 3-4 people from another unit, well, 2 different units that do portray Early War. So we had at least some people in M36 and jackboots.
Cool. What kind of property was it where you guys did this tactical, or where was it?
The area belongs to the family of one of our unit members, who's also in the Norwegian unit. And the area is a 740-ish acres large, and it has its own small lake, small hilltops, woodland, open area, a road.
Sounds awesome. Sounds like a perfect place.
It is quite perfect. It's also just an hour and a half drive outside of Oslo, and it's totally isolated. There's very few people around.
It's ideal. You guys are lucky to have a place like that.
We certainly feel lucky for it, and thank you to Adrian, who's the guy in the unit who has hooked us up with it.
From how far away did the did the Norwegian unit have to travel? Or those guys mostly live in the same area or areas where you guys live?
Yeah, they do. The other early war Germans, they came from across the country on the west coast. So
Wow.
they had if they drove, they would probably be driving for 8 or 9 hours.
That's a long drive. But certainly, I think worth it. You guys did something that I guess really had never been done before. So congratulations on that. That's awesome.
Thank you. It feels great to actually have accomplished the first all-Norwegian World War II tactical. We've had other tacticals, but then we've had other units invited who come from Sweden, Denmark, and elsewhere.
It's a great thing to be able to have local events for local people. And we have that here where I live. There are events that I travel to, and then there are events that are just kind of almost exclusively people maybe within, say, 3 or 4 hours or something like that of a drive. And I like to be able to do stuff like that too. I'm glad you guys had that. That's great.
Yeah. What about yourself? Did you have any events?
Yeah, we did an event last weekend, which was a fantastic event for us for a few reasons. First of all, as I think I mentioned in the previous episode, I hadn't actually done any kind of reenacting for months. So it was great to get the uniform on again and get out there and do something.
Did it still fit?
It still did fit. Yes. Well, I get my uniforms a little bit on the bigger side just in case. But no, it fit. Everything was great. This event was a public display. It was Armory Day at the Springfield Armory, which is a national historic site. So I guess it's actually owned by the American federal government. And that's really cool because the coordinator of that event is a National Park Service park ranger. So someone who works for the government. And this is a person who has credentials and is a serious person with some skills and understanding in historical interpretation and events. So that the fact that we even got invited to this thing was great because, as I'm sure people can understand, there's kind of some pressure happening lately that is against World War II German portrayals because of political reasons. So the fact that we got to go to this was great. Also, we got paid. They appreciate reenactors, what reenactors bring to the table. It's an attraction to their event. It brings people to their site. And so in this case of this particular site, they have a budget and they decided to use part of their budget to pay reenactors for their time and effort in coming and setting up at their event. And that made me feel really good. I mean, even more than just about the money, right? Because it wasn't like a tremendous amount of money or anything. It's a relatively small amount, but just as kind of like a token of, listen, we appreciate that what you are doing is something that has value and you should get something for that. That feels really, really good and makes me feel really good about doing that event.
Well, that's great. I think you talked about this specific event in one of the earlier episodes too.
Yeah, we were gearing up for it. And so I'd never done this event before. So we got there and they had set aside a place for us to go. In fact, there was a little sign that had the name of my group on it. And we set up a Zeltbahn tent and we had a bunch of weapons. And we didn't bring any furniture, which was kind of different. All of the other groups that were there, which was time periods ranging from like Plymouth Colony, the early English settlement of New England in the 1600s, through the Korean War. So you had this tremendous amount of time that was represented with different groups and individuals doing different things. There was also some people portraying other foreign armies. There was some British reenactors there. There was a bunch of World War II reenactors there, and of course Civil War. Even there was I think Spanish American War or Indian Wars stuff. Anyway, so the spot that we got, I think it was the best spot in the entire property. It was underneath a giant tree that must have been hundreds of years old. We were in shade the entire day, which was so nice because it was a beautiful sunny day. And the whole event went from 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it wasn't a tremendous investment of time. The site was only about an hour and a half from where I live, so it was an easy drive to get there. And the people who attended this display event, the spectators, there was like two kinds of people. There were people who were really interested in history, and then there were people who had kids and they wanted their kids to learn something about history. So it was people who wanted to talk to us, people who liked seeing what we had set up, and the day flew by in a flash. It was a lot of fun, a lot of good questions, met some interesting people. I met some people who I think might get started in reenacting, which is always nice to see. And the event just left me feeling really good and positive. It was a good event for my group. I think a couple of guys had to bail out last minute, but we had 4 people there, which was a great crew to do our little display. I don't know if I'm going to bring a table next time. I think on one level, it was cool that we didn't have a table or any furniture because it kind of enabled us to show a little bit more how things really were, right? Like people would come and we're just there sitting on the ground with our stuff. On the other hand, every other group had a table, and if you're sitting on the ground, it's a little bit more difficult for somebody to like approach you and strike up a conversation. So like we wound up kind of standing around a lot of the time. So I don't know, we'll discuss it prior to the event next year and decide if we want to incorporate a table or not.
One thing that could work is prop up 2 jerry cans and have a wooden board across.
That's a great idea. Like a more realistic type of like a field made table, sure.
Yeah, don't bring out the mahogany grand dinner table.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the table is cool. We had my Zeltbahn on the ground with some standard field equipment type stuff that a soldier would carry that was kind of laid on the Zeltbahn, so people could kind of get down there and look at it. And I think that was good for like children. So children are close to the ground anyway because they're short, and they kind of enjoyed handling the canteen and stuff like that. So I don't know. There's, I guess, a few different approaches to doing it. Maybe there probably isn't any right or wrong answer, but something to think about for next time.
Absolutely.
Other than that, not too much is new with me. Just before we went live on this podcast, I won an eBay auction, which was fun. I'm glad that happened before we started recording because I get like really freaked out when an eBay auction is about to end. You know, my heart is racing, and it wasn't anything special. I bought some 1940 era German typewriter ribbons, just kind of as display pieces to have with my typewriters. That's it. Well, look, I was excited because prior to World War II, most typewriter ribbons came in metal tins. Some of them came in little Bakelite boxes. But of course, when the war started, metal became an important war resource. So they stopped making the tins for the typewriter ribbons, and they switched to using simple cardboard boxes with the logo of the manufacturer. And probably not that many of those survived because unlike the tins, which could be reused later for other things, these boxes had no real use afterwards. So I haven't actually seen many of the wartime cardboard boxes. And this was an auction on German eBay for 5 of them in one auction. And I won it for €20. I was the only bidder. So that's exciting. And
congratulations.
Thanks, Lasse. Yeah, that might be the highlight of my day. Besides talking with you, of course. But yeah, so that's what I've got going on. And as far as our next event, I'm sure I'll be talking about that in a future episode. It's going to be an immersion event that I'm planning, and it's going to be in about 4 weeks.
That's very nice. We don't have any events planned in the immediate future. We got a big Belgium event in late August, and it seems that we may just spend all our time preparing for that event, sadly.
Yeah, I love getting out. You know, we've talked about this a little bit more. I'd like to do something every month, but the flip side of that is that if you have 2 months to prepare for your next event, I think you can be more prepared. And I'm sure you guys could probably even get together and make sure that your gear is all set up and everything is perfect the way that you want it to be.
Yeah, we're also bringing a truck to Belgium, which is kind of far away. So
that's a huge endeavor. Too. Yeah, that's awesome. That's really going the extra mile and putting the effort in. I love it.
What's reenactment if you don't do it correctly?
You got to, it's not even just doing it correctly. I think it's doing it in a way that is absolutely insane, like taking an old truck across multiple national borders for a weekend. That's the way to do it.
Well, it'll be a week-long event, so.
Oh, right. All right, cool.
I was actually supposed to be at an event this weekend as well in England, but in the end, I couldn't go, sadly.
That event looks like a lot of fun, and I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of pictures from that event in England.
I hope so. There's many of my good friends there from all over Europe.
Yeah, so someone sent me some pictures even from the parking lot, and looks like a really good group. And of course, I have a little bit of a feeling of missing out when people in some other part of the world are doing some kind of fun event, and I can't be there.
Yeah,
Monty's Men, right? That's the name of it. It's kind of a weird name for a reenactment event, but I guess that's sort of typical. Most reenactment events that have names probably are just weird names anyway.
Yeah, well, Monty's Men is kind of like an organization of British reenactors who do events, and this is just one of their events.
Oh, okay, neat. Yeah, looks like a lot of fun, and like I say, I'll be looking forward to seeing the pictures from that. Well, I guess we should just break right into talking about this food stuff for this, our big topic for today, which this is something I'm actually excited to talk about, not only because I love food, but because in the old help pages that we used to run and elsewhere on social media, elsewhere on the internet, talking about food is, I mean, it's a big topic, right? A lot of people want to hear about it or have ideas about it, want to hear ideas about it. So definitely a good thing for us to dive into, I think.
Well, at one point you posted like a weekly soup recipe almost.
I was definitely posting a lot of recipes, and I don't know, maybe it was too much, but but I wanted to start talking about kind of the most basic concept, and then at the end we can kind of expand it a little bit. So to start, I want to talk about, like, I think what is probably the most common thing that people are thinking about when they're thinking about rations, which is rations for one person for one day. Like, if you're an individual reenactor, you're going to go to an event, maybe it's just for the day, you need to bring a meal for yourself that you're going to eat in the field. That's a period correct meal. What do you bring? And let's say, obviously, you guys being in Europe are going to have some different options for food and different brands and stuff. So we might have some different ideas about it. But I guess I'll just start by saying, all right, so for me personally, and for if somebody in my group was like, all right, Chris, we're doing this event, it's just a day, we're not going to have like a communal unit meal at this event for some reason, what should I bring? I would say you want to bring some food that you can eat cold. So I would suggest bringing canned food. I would suggest bringing maybe some bread, meat, and or cheese, and stuff to put in your butter dish. So I guess we'll start with the canned food. World War II German cans. They weren't exactly the same as cans that you can get at the supermarket today in a few different ways. They were made out of steel for the most part. Fish cans were made out of aluminum. It was different from the, I guess, I don't know, tin or tin-plated steel cans of today. Also, the cans were, the steel food cans were like smooth-sided, whereas modern cans they have like usually kind of ripples on there. And the types of aluminum cans that they had back then, we don't really have that kind of can anymore at all. So, and one other thing, of course, a big thing is pop tops. A lot of cans nowadays have this pop top, whereas generally speaking, World War II cans you had to open every time with a can opener. So I guess this is another thing kind of where perfect becomes the enemy of the good. And it's not really reasonable for us to expect that somebody is going to be able to buy a 1940s era canning machine and make canned food that is absolutely correct for World War II. So instead, I focus on making sure that what is inside the can is correct stuff and doing what I can to try to choose cans that are as close as possible. I mean, Lasse, what do you guys have for cans in Norway? Do you have some more Zoni type cans?
We have some that are Zoni, but most are not. Pull tabs are the common way of opening all cans in Norway. And quite recently, they actually announced that cans will disappear in favor of a cardboard variant.
That's crazy.
Yeah, because technology is so good that you can basically get a better expiry date on cardboard boxes, and it will be cheaper to produce and cheaper to transport because you can pack it more tightly.
This is like an interesting aspect of reenacting where time marches on, and we can't hold on to the past. So even things that we use today that are similar to old ways of doing things, they are going to continue to disappear and be replaced with newer ways.
Exactly. But one thing we do is, like here in Norway, most canned food have the packaging just printed right on the metal. So one thing we do is we just spray paint it with a rattle can black, and
Cool.
we use pliers to remove the pull tab.
That's cool. That's a great approach, I think.
Yeah, if you use pliers carefully from a Leatherman or something, and you can twist it around and just like it's very quick. But then again, you can puncture the can, but be careful, and it's pretty easy.
That's an awesome tip. I've never actually done that. I have sprayed the cans, spray painted them black, but I've just spray painted right over the pull tab. It never even occurred to me that you could remove it and make it look more realistic. That's great.
Yeah, I mean it's quite easy. So try it.
I will try it. Yeah, spray painting the cans is something that I've done a lot here in America. Most cans have a paper label, so I'll do one of two things. I'll just remove the label completely and then have kind of a bare metal can, which is something that appears sometimes in original photos, or we'll spray paint the cans black. The original German steel cans were actually called Schwarzblechdosen, which means black sheet metal cans. The colors of original cans, I think, varied. I've seen some that were kind of like had sort of a dark reddish lacquer on them. I've seen some of them that had a golden colored lacquer, and then in original photos, I see some that are kind of a very dark color. So I think that I can't say for absolute certain, right, that like black enamel painted cans definitely were like a common or a prevalent thing, but I think that the appearance of a black enamel painted can is in line enough with the range of original cans that I think it looks good. I think it looks right.
I agree. I totally agree. But there's also the thing that canned food isn't necessarily as authentic as we think, because canned food back then was quite expensive, and if you're going to issue canned food to every soldier, you have to transport said canned food to every soldier from the factory.
You're absolutely right. Canned food is kind of a sort of a cheat method, right? It's like a cop-out because I think it is worth probably saying at this point that the average soldier's meal each day consisted of fresh bulk foods that were prepared at the field kitchen and that were delivered to him in his mess kit. So when you're dealing with an army, hundreds of men in a unit, thousands of men even, that was what they found to be the best way to feed these people. Of course, you as an individual reenactor, be able to rely on a supply system like how things really were during World War II. So you might have to bring your own food, and that's where canned food can kind of be a sort of a crutch, even if it's not the actual most authentic thing or how guys typically ate every day.
Yeah, absolutely. But then again, I think there's other ways to prepare food than to have canned food.
Yeah, I agree. And like for the individual person, if you're looking at food for one, I know that cans existed, and a soldier might have been able. This becomes some kind of like quasi farb. If they had it, they would have used it. Line of thinking, right? But the reality is, there are photographs that have soldiers with cans of food. I know that in archaeological excavations, or when people are checking out trash pits that German soldiers used, they find food cans in there. I have some relic ground dug food cans. I see a lot of like fish cans, so I know that they must have had access to canned fish. So I don't think it's really wrong. But yeah, maybe not the best, but maybe your only option if it's for one person. Obviously, there's other things that you can bring. You can bring like sausages, like hard salami, something that's cured that is going to be able to survive in your mess kit for a day without spoiling. Hard salami was something that a soldier might have had access to. Cheese was definitely something that was issued. You could have spreadable cheese in your butter dish, or maybe you could have some hard cheese that you managed to get one way or another. And different types of bread, of course, bread being a very important daily staple for the German soldier, something that would definitely have been issued. And that could be in the form of some kind of brown loaf bread. The original stuff was Kommissbrot, or you could use like a Knäckebrot substitute, which is like a flat, unleavened bread that a lot of, here in America, and probably in other parts of the world too, there's this Wasa or Vasa crisp bread that you can get at the supermarket that's a good stand-in for the original type Knäckebrot bread.
Yeah, Knäckebrot is also quite easy to make yourself as well.
Cool. I've never tried doing that. I bet that's delicious and fun.
Should try it.
I should. One thing that I have had before, I haven't made this, but multiple people in my group have made this at various times, is I guess it's Zwieback, the like little hard sort of biscuits that were issued. And that's something that there's recipes available for that online. And you can make it yourself. There's also some kind of like Japanese cracker that oddly is like supposedly almost identical to the Wehrmacht issue, Zwieback.
Yeah, Zwieback is very easy to make, but then again, it's not necessarily food. Zwieback existed to give soldiers salt.
Interesting.
Because it basically is water, flour, and salt. And if you drink a lot of water but you don't get salt in your body, the water will the water won't stay in your body, so you won't hydrate even though you drink. So you need to add salt to your body to keep the water into your body so you hydrate.
That makes sense.
So that's basically what Zwieback was made for.
Awesome. Salt vehicle. I like that. That stuff is delicious as well, even if it can be hard to chew. I don't really know. I don't know if anyone really knows what exactly the consistency was of the real stuff. There are some photographs of it, and it's described in the U.S. Army report on rations. I think it's an interesting detail that you can have.
A guy in our unit makes it like not like a cracker, but more like a soft bread, and it's delicious.
I bet that's better. The stuff that I've had mostly is so hard that you almost have to like, you basically have to like suck on it to soak it in your own saliva before you could even try to chew it. I mean, like you break your teeth on it.
Yeah, you do that or sacrifice your teeth.
Well, the other advantage of that is that this stuff kind of lasts forever. I actually was at an event and I reached into my pocket and I found some that I had been in my pocket literally for months, And I thought, geez, I wonder if this is still good. And I ate a piece, and it was delicious. And I shared the rest of it with the guys in my group without telling them that it had been in the pocket of my field blouse for months. And everybody enjoyed it. It was a cool treat for everybody.
Well, that's neat.
I mentioned briefly that U.S. Army report on German rations, and that basically forms the backbone of a book by Jim Poole that's called Rations of the German Wehrmacht in World War II. And I would recommend this book. It's kind of expensive, but nice things cost money. You got to pay sometimes for good information, and there's a lot better information in that book than what somebody is likely to find searching around on the internet. But there's one thing in that book in that U.S. Army report that I think is really kind of important, and that is a list of the contents of the German military black steel ration cans. And we're going to put a link in the show notes for this podcast, where on my festering.net website, I've got some scans from Jim Poole from the U.S. Army rations report, and it talks about what was in these cans. Now, obviously, these weren't cans that were issued to every soldier every day. They were probably for specific purposes, maybe used by field kitchens to augment the fresh bulk food that they had when they had to augment it. But it's interesting to see what's in that list, right? Like there's corned beef in there, beef stew is on the list, a bunch of different types of things that you could probably get in canned form at the supermarket and eat it knowing that what is in your can was something similar, the same type of food at least, that could have been eaten by German soldiers in World War II.
As far as I understand it, the use of that food, or the iron ration, was to be, like, every soldier was supposed to have one, but it was only to be eaten if they didn't get food from the field kitchen.
Well, you're right. The iron ration, I think, was a different type of a food can than like these food cans on the list. The iron ration had some kind of Fleischkonserve can in it, and for those who aren't familiar with this concept, the German soldiers had this thing called either an iron ration or a half iron ration. The half iron ration consisted of some Zwieback or Knäckebrot type bread and a can of meat. And this was something that was carried either by the individual soldiers themselves or that was carried for them by their unit, kept with the field kitchen or kept with the Tross of the unit. And then you were only supposed to eat this when you were ordered to eat it. So I think that it's important this is kind of my subjective opinion about it. I think that it's important for reenactors to have an understanding of what the iron ration was, but I don't try to replicate this and eat it because it wasn't what soldiers ate every day. It was something that they were supposed to eat in an emergency situation that's different from what we're usually portraying at reenactments. Is that how you guys use it, Lasse? I mean, I at one time I had a reproduction iron ration that I kept it in my bread bag all the time as kind of a visual prop or a representation of something that a soldier might have carried I never actually ate it.
Well, in Norway, you can actually get surplus rations from the army, from their previous type of rations, which they had until the late 90s, from like the 50s to the late 90s, which is basically more or less identical to the contents of the iron ration, which is mashed potatoes, fat, beef, just like a big mash of that. And they're in Verizoni cans, and they don't have an expiry date. The oldest I've eaten was from 1968.
Wow.
It tastes just as good as them from 1994. And like sometimes we will carry that, but mostly we don't use any canned food at all. And we just go with fresh meat, fresh eggs, vegetables, fruit.
That's great.
And we prepare that instead.
That's the best. And for anybody who is in a reenactment group, I strongly encourage you to, if you're not already doing this, and most people probably already are, is to have like unit level meals. where you guys can either pool resources or one person brings it and maybe people give him money after the event or whatever. And because that's more to cook fresh bulk foods is more correct and more realistic.
Yeah, we do that. We do this also at an individual level as well. Although we do have some, like a large pot and stuff, we won't bring that to any event. So sometimes we just have the mess tins. We fill them up with vegetables and fruit, and we just prepare it individually.
That's really cool. That's I'm sure that's very realistic and is something that happens pretty often. I wanted to touch on like the butter dish. So every German soldier was issued this little round kind of plastic container. And it was called a Fettbuchse or a Fettdose, so a fat dish. And this was part of the daily rations for every soldier for every day. You got issued bread, and you also got issued something to spread on your bread. And this is a traditional sort of German cultural mindset thing where Butterbrot is a meal for them, even to this day, for many people in Germany, that bread with something on it is a meal. Whereas in America, of course, we eat pounds of bacon and burgers and pizza for every meal.
It's the same in it's the same in Scandinavia. We're even more reliant on the bread and butter culture than Germany is.
Wow, that's kind of like speaking for my personal palate as an American. I don't know. I guess I have. In traveling to Germany in the past, I sort of learned to, if not love it, at least enjoy it. But I mean, the first time it was like, hey, what are we having for, what's lunch today? And it's like, oh, it's bread, and butter, or maybe some like spreadable sausage. I didn't see very much to be excited about in that. But for reenactment, I love it. I bring my butter dish, and there's lots of different correct things that soldiers could have been issued in their butter dish each day that you can still get and put in there, like butter or margarine or honey is another thing that was sometimes in the butter dish. Different types of spreadable sausage, which you might be able to get at like a European deli in America, or spreadable cheese that you can get at the supermarket. That's correct too.
There's also the horrible goose fat schmaltz stuff.
Yeah, there's different types of schmaltz. I mean, it wouldn't technically, I think, be wrong to have just regular pig lard, like regular lard from the grocery store is a sort of a schmaltz that in theory they could have been issued. And of course, spreading that on your bread is for a lot of people a pretty gross concept, but that was probably not a gross concept at all for German people in the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
And like you said, that you can make it with goose fat. You can fry little bits of onions or whatever fat and pour it into your butter dish and let it cool. That kind of thing is not wrong.
Yeah, I mean, for us, when we prepare like food spread and like bread spread and bread for events, it's more or less like us preparing for in Norway, it is common for people to bring food from home to work, and that's usually bread with spreads on it, because that's the common culture. So whenever we prepare that for events, we just it's like preparing breakfast. There's nothing special with it.
Yeah, that's very different from here in America, where bread with spreads as a meal is just, it's like almost unknown. And somebody might want to counter signal me and tell me that they eat bread and spreads every day, but that's definitely not like the cultural norm for sure.
Yeah, a common spread in Scandinavia is, for example, a liver pate.
Well, that sounds pretty gross to me, but I'm sure that's obviously there was different types of spreadable Streifwurst that was made with liver that German soldiers could have had. So I'll try to eat anything that I think that German soldiers could have been issued, but I don't know. Organ meat freaks me out, and I don't eat it. I know that's comes from like a place of privilege, right? Living in the 21st century with all the abundance, I can pick and choose what kind of meats I prefer to eat. I don't know.
I mean, you should try a fresh, warm liver pate on a fresh, warm bread.
Oh, on a hot day like today, oh man, that sounds gross. That sounds gross, but I would probably do it for the zone, just for the zone.
The problem is you love it.
Maybe I would love it if I could get past my own.
I mean, you would love it.
Over
no one does
eating
not
an animal's
love it.
liver. Well, I'm sure it's good, and would I try it? Sure, but I'd have to be in uniform, otherwise I'm not
going. All right.
So I did want to talk about some stuff that. Oh, I know. Before I finish up with this bread and spreads, jam, various types of jams and jellies is also a correct thing that anyone with access to a store has access to some kind of jam, and that can be delicious after a day of marching around.
Yeah. Strawberry jam, for example.
Now, the thing about the butter dish that oftentimes is kind of irritating to me is that people will put in their foodstuffs that the German soldier definitely did not have in World War II. The number one offender of this is peanut butter. Germans don't really eat peanut butter today, and in World War II, they definitely not only did not eat peanut butter, but did not have access to peanut butter. There simply was no peanut butter in their universe. So if you're trying to portray a Wehrmacht soldier and you're bringing peanut butter, you're doing it wrong, and you should bring something else.
Yeah. As said, we eat bread all the time, so whatever we put in a butter dish is usually authentic, and it's usually butter.
Sure. Yeah, right. Obviously, you guys have like a different cultural thing, but for us, people are not used to this bread and spreads concept, so they'll put beef jerky in there, which is another thing that is just not really a thing for Germans and not for Germans at the time. Or I don't know, I see guys using their butter dish to store tobacco, which I guess it's a functional use, but for a soldier who was getting edible goo in your butter dish every day, you weren't going to be wanting to keep tobacco in there.
Yeah, that sounds horrible.
It's totally gross. Also, like I've seen guys, they have tea bags in there, which again is a functional thing, but you're not. I mean, this was like an important everyday object where it was filled with some kind of fat or sticky goo, and you couldn't use it for storing. You couldn't use it as a pantry, right? You couldn't use it for storing your dry food stuff. So it had a use, and that was what you had to do with it.
Yeah.
I wanted to also mention that there's another link that we'll put in the show notes, which is an article that I translated for. It's from an original cookbook, and it's ideas for improving cold food. So if all you have is canned meat or some vegetables, right? How can you cook that in a way that's going to make it into a more delicious meal? So one example idea for how to make meatballs using bread or breadcrumbs and canned meat. Also, there's a recipe in there that I have cooked dozens of times. This is a staple thing for me. It's called Ölsoldaten, so oil soldiers, and it is canned fish, lemon juice, and onion chopped up and mixed together, and then you fry it. And you can fry it in the lid of your mess kit over a fire, and it's absolutely delicious. And I serve that on some knäckebröd or some rye bread, and it's absolutely delicious.
That does sound good.
The original recipe calls for it to be made with sardines, but there's a note in there that if you don't have sardines, or if you prefer, you can substitute it with canned tuna fish, and that's how I do it. So it's like tuna fish, oil, and lemon juice, and onions, and it is absolutely delicious.
Sounds great. There's one thing I would like to get in here before we strive too far away from canned foods.
Yeah,
and that is one should never prepare food in the can, because
that's a great point.
Modern cans usually they have an epoxy layer inside to protect the food from the metal, and you will basically melt the epoxy and mix it in the food, and over time that can potentially be a health problem.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Yeah, you can't cook inside the can. But the mess kit is a great vessel for cooking. You can boil stuff in the bottom part. You can fry stuff in the top part. So, and yeah, it's not as simple as a can that you can just throw away afterward. You have to clean out your mess kit, but that's part of the fun.
And it's safe.
And it is absolutely, well, I mean, it's aluminum. All right, so I guess moving on, we'll talk about some ideas about cooking fresh bulk food, which is the more authentic way to do it. In my group, we do it kind of on a unit level, as I mentioned, and I've got a lot of recipes that were original field kitchen recipes, or some of them that were recipes for soldiers to make themselves if they had access to food that they could make for themselves. And there's kind of an endless amount of variety of different recipes that you can use, and we'll put some links in the show notes for people to look at some real recipes, and then I guess we can talk about some ways that you can kind of adapt original recipes to make something that is correct and with stuff that's available and that you can kind of store for at a reenactment, even if you're going to be out there maybe for a weekend or even a week. So, Lasse, I know you were saying that you guys do some individual stuff where you'll put vegetables in your mess kits and cook them. Do you do? But you do have a big pot, right? You also do unit level meals sometimes.
Yeah, we do.
What do you guys usually cook?
Well, the most basic thing to cook is basically a goulash of some sorts. So we'll bring whatever vegetable we feel like bringing when we're at the store to buy them, and then we cook it.
Nice. Do you guys put meat in there?
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. When we do put meat in it, we never put a lot of meat in there.
That's a really good point. It's the same with us. The meat was scarce, and our meals are also either meatless or like low in meat.
Yeah. And another thing we do when we make it on a unit level from our big pot, we want to simulate that it is the field kitchen that's making it for us. So we always try to thin it out a little bit on the thin side with water, make it a little bit tasteless. Because even though there's a chef who makes it, the chef is probably bored out of his motherfucking life making all of this food. And he doesn't care. He just makes the best out of, or doesn't make the best out of what he has.
Right. I think that their meals were, their hot, fresh meals were pretty meager by modern standards.
Yeah, I mean, as Nicholas in my unit says, the chef doesn't care about food, and you will always find hair in the food, although the chef is bald.
That's awesome. I had a weird experience one time where I was at a pub that had a lot of people there, and there were some German veterans that came. This was years ago. And I talked to two guys who had served on the Eastern Front. And I asked the first guy, how was the food? He said the food was absolutely terrible. You know, it was inedible. It was disgusting. There was never enough of it. And this echoed what a lot of other veterans had told me. I remember one guy told me that you were thrilled to get something like pea soup just to have something that had some substance to it, some bulk to it. But then I asked another veteran on the same day, he served on the Eastern Front, and I said, what was the food like? He said, it was wonderful. Our chef was great. We had roasts, we had meat, you know, and I'm hearing this guy talk about it, and it's like, well, I guess on some level, it could really have depended on your chef, the cook in your unit, how much he cared, if he cared at all, how resourceful he might have been at securing supplies of food for the guys in his group. So
another point is, if the chef sees a little bit of beef, will he throw it in a pot or will he keep it for himself?
Sure, that's a good point too. One thing I'll say from translating cookbooks is it will say repeatedly, and I've read this in multiple cookbooks, the soldier wants to see the meat. So don't cut the meat up into pieces that are too small. If the meat is cut up into pieces that are so small it basically disappears into the food, it might as well not even be there. So that's kind of how it is for us too. I'll cut the meat up into like larger pieces, and maybe you only have 1 or 2 pieces of meat in your mess kit, but it's at least like a chunk of meat that you can chew on. For us, we usually I'm usually the guy that cooks the stuff in my group more often than not. So I have a big pot, and I'll build a fire, and I'll heat up the food over the fire. My go-to is like a potato and cabbage stew, which there's endless variations of how you can make this stew. I'll use a head of cabbage and some potatoes, and then the other ingredients, depending on what you put in there, it can have very different flavors. Something that existed that German soldiers were issued during World War II was dehydrated vegetables, which they called Drahtverhau, which translates to like a barbed wire entanglement. And dehydrated vegetables, of course, eating it raw is inconceivable and gross. So I will bring like sometimes a vegetable soup mix that's made out of predominantly dehydrated vegetables as well as some spices. And I'll put that into the soup, which adds some flavor to it as well. And I think is something that's historically at least plausible.
Yeah, we also use a lot of stock.
Good. Yeah, stock is good. Bouillon cubes are something that definitely were used by German soldiers that they would or could have had access to. So if I don't use like the vegetable soup mix, I'll throw vegetable or chicken bouillon cubes in there.
Yeah,
and that will make it a tasty broth. And of course, a lot of times I'll bring salt, or sometimes I'll bring something else that I've seen in other recipes. For example, a lot of goulash recipes had Hungarian paprika in there, or paprika of some kind. So I'll bring some of that. I'll either put some of it into a little glass jar, or I'll just have like a wax paper packet that has some seasonings in there that I can put in there to give it some flavor. I mean, not every time, but sometimes.
Yeah, it sounds delicious to me.
The people in my group love the meals that I make. They're all based more or less strictly on original recipes. And it's there's like a kind of a thing that happens at reenactment where you get really hungry, and a food that might be totally gross if you were going to eat it at home is suddenly somehow delicious.
Some of the best food I've ever eaten has been the most tasteless shit during events.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the best meals. Our cooking pot is a big spun aluminum pot that I bought at a supermarket. So it's just like a big, regular aluminum colored pot, and it has a lid. And I have multiple original photos that show this exact same type of pot in use. I did like a limited amount of research about what kind of pots they could have had. And I found that they had these spun aluminum pots. They also had enameled steel pots. I've seen blue enameled steel. I've seen black enameled steel. Sometimes they have handles at the side of the top of the pot, and sometimes they don't. So there's a lot of different variables. And if someone is out there and they're thinking, I want to be a guy who's making food for my reenactment group, and we don't have a field kitchen that we can tow, then take a look at some original photos, get a sense of what pots look like, and then just try to find a big pot that fits within that general range of pots that you can use.
Yeah. And sadly, not having a field kitchen nearby is kind of like a Farby compromise you have to make.
Generally speaking, you're absolutely right. Most soldiers were getting food from the field kitchen every day. Part of the reason why my group chose to portray a Sicherung unit impression was because we were able to find like pretty abundant documentation that in many of these units, because they were spread out so much in these vast areas that they had to garrison, there were troops that weren't getting fed from the field kitchen. They weren't being supplied by a TROS every day. So for us, it's something that we can portray, I think, realistically. But sure, in many situations, it requires a little bit of a suspension of disbelief, right? Where you're pretending, okay, usually we get a field kitchen meal every day, but right now we're in a situation, whether we're in transit or we just got here and the rest of the unit hasn't caught up yet or whatever it is, you kind of have to make an excuse for why you're cooking in a pot and not getting food from a field kitchen.
Yeah, it all depends on the scenario.
Yeah, with some creativity, you can kind of invent your own scenarios where like you don't have to have the field kitchen, where it makes sense maybe to be cooking out of a pot.
Yeah, that's more or less what we do all the time.
The unit that I used to be in, that I was in for a long time, started reenacting. When I started reenacting, we had a field kitchen that we were borrowing from somebody else, and we had to give it back, and then we didn't have a field kitchen for a long time, and then we didn't have a field kitchen for a long time, and then we actually pooled our money and we bought a surplus East German field kitchen, which is very similar, or at least similar enough, in my opinion, to the Wehrmacht field kitchen. And that was a really, really cool asset that we had. It was cool for displays. We could show people how the German military prepared meals for their soldiers, but it had some limitations too. One of which is that you've got this thing that really is intended for creating food for 100 people. And if we only had 10 guys at the event, this giant kettle thing really isn't the best way to make a meal for 10 people. And what we tried to do was we tried to reach out to other units and said, hey, are you guys interested in eating from the field kitchen? If you guys can kick in $5 a day or something, you can come and eat at the field kitchen, or send somebody with a Essenträger to get food from the field kitchen, and you can serve it to your guys. But we didn't have a lot of buy-in from that usually. A lot of units kind of already had their own way of doing things, and didn't want to have to rely on some other unit for their food needs. So, from a practical perspective, and of course, I'll say that the field kitchen was something that was at the Tross in the rear area. It wasn't something that was at the foremost lines. It wasn't something where, with your little cluster of Zeltbahn tents, you were likely to have a field kitchen there. It worked in a different way.
Totally. I mean, if at an event a unit came up to us and said that we can buy food from their field kitchen, I'm like, of course.
Sure, we would almost certainly do the same. But there's a level of trust there too, right? Because I've actually seen this, if I decide that I want the field kitchen meal, and then they serve me hot dogs and baked beans out of the field kitchen, or they serve me kind of the reenactor trope of like a big bratwurst and sauerkraut, I'm not going to be thrilled. I mean, I'm eating something that's not realistic, even if it was prepared in a realistic way.
Yeah, this is true. And that reminds me that the Germans didn't only have the field kitchen, which everybody knows of, but they also had I'm not sure if every unit had them, but there were some large mobile ovens that they used to make bread in.
Yeah, field bakeries. I know they had those at a divisional level, certainly, and I'm sure that sometimes they probably had them even at company.
Yeah, you have the large one that takes like 200 breads, but you also have a few smaller ones which takes 50 and 100.
I've never seen that portrayed at a reenactment. I would lose my mind with joy if I saw someone doing a mobile field bakery, baking bread and supplying it to the troops. It'd be awesome.
I mean, we haven't seen it in a reenactment context, but at public displays there have been people making baguettes, breads, pizza, and buns in them.
It's interesting. In the German ones? The German ovens?
Yeah, in original German field bakeries. Cool. But it hasn't been in a reenactment context, but it has been to sell to the public and stuff.
That's really cool.
And I have to say, buns heated in a original German field bakery is the best buns you can
Wow,
eat.
I love it. Yeah, German bread culture is really cool, and that's something that I miss from when I used to travel there more frequently, was the bakeries and the breads. We don't have anything like that in America, generally speaking.
You got donuts.
I mean, we got bread, but it's like we got a lot of processed white. Obviously, if you're listening to this and you're a new reenactor wanting to go to your first event, when I'm talking about bread, do not bring sliced white bread. They didn't have anything like that. You want to get something. Look for some kind of whole grain bread and not pre-sliced. Yeah,
totally.
Options might be limited a little bit. There's a supermarket chain near where I live that sells some kind of bread. I think they call it a European breakfast roll or something like that, and it's like a kind of a good sized roll that has seeds and stuff in it, and I think it's like a reasonably passable representation of a German type Brötchen, even if it's not like the issue type bread. I mean, the issue type bread was a fairly good sized loaf. Sliced white bread is totally outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I'm so glad I don't struggle with this issue. If I want authentic bread, I go to whatever store and I have a selection of like 50 different ones.
I'm endlessly jealous of the resources that reenactors in Europe still have, especially with regard to food. Not just food, but certainly food being the primary thing. The food that we have here at the supermarket is the options that we have at the supermarket for something that could pass as World War II German era food are definitely much more limited here in America.
Yeah, and when it comes to the white sliced bread you're talking of, in Norway, that type of bread has its own name, which is not bread.
Right, it's how it is. It's weird. Like I remember seeing that stuff rarely in Germany, and they would like call it toast. They would call it the American word for toasted sliced white bread. I mean, it's foreign. It's foreign to them.
Yeah.
It's not. They don't have that kind of thing. And
yeah, there's one brand that sells them as toast bread.
Why does anybody even eat it? I mean, it's like for children. It's like this tasteless substance. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense.
Full of sugar.
Yeah, it's like super bad for you, right? Part of the fun of reenacting is getting in touch with other ways of doing things. Some of them I do them, and I think, boy, I'm so glad that we've developed technological advancements where I don't have to do things this way in my daily life, and then other things I think some of the old ways were the best way.
Well, that's how you think with everything when you start reenacting.
Yeah, get some interesting perspective. And I guess kind of the last couple of things I wanted to talk about with food, I would hit a little bit on like snacks, like candy. Most German reenactors are familiar with Schoka-Cola, the German.
They didn't have anything else,
well, that's right? Kind of what I wanted to talk about here is that, and this is going to be my subjective interpretation, and it's pretty controversial. And I know some people are probably gonna hate me for saying it, but I don't carry Schoka-Cola. I won't carry Schoka-Cola because I just think it's this like reenactment trope where to look at or to hear a lot of reenactors talk about this, you would think that every German soldier was issued a metal box filled with chocolate every day. And that's not how it was. This wasn't like a daily staple for people that they were eating this particular brand of chocolate every day.
What do you mean, Chris? Haven't you seen 1993 movie Stalingrad?
I mean, I'll say this. Talking to veterans, when I mention Schoka-Cola to them, generally speaking, or when I used to interview guys in the past, they knew what it was and they knew about it, but it wasn't like, oh yeah, I ate that every day, right? Like I constantly had a tin of chocolate in my bread bag, or like to put it in perspective, if I asked German soldiers about chocolate, former German soldiers, they would say, oh, I don't know, maybe, it existed, it was around, but it wasn't like something that they regarded as typical of their daily food experience in the military.
Yeah, and like chocolate was even, it was rationed during the war for civilians as well.
Right, it wasn't...
It's a luxury good.
It was a luxury good, and I'm sure that for soldiers who had Schoka-Cola, it was, and not their everyday. Listen, I feel like I have to say this because someone is going to say, well, I have seen this come out of digs. It's like, I understand that Schoka-Cola existed. I understand that there were times that soldiers had it. And I'm not saying you're a farb if you have it. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think that we as a reenactment community should be able to look past this one food stuff that existed then and that happens to exist now as well in a slightly different form, and not just rely on this crutch of like, okay, there's a Third Reich brand that still exists, so that's going to be my reenactment go-to all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of the same with the USGIs, who always bring Coca-Cola.
Sure, it was one of many different things, and it's and that's how it was with even candy and sweets, to the extent that German soldiers were issued sweets, which they were sometimes issued sweets, and they could be in the form of bonbons or hard candy or any one of a whole wide range of different products and goods. So I think it's better. I don't personally bring candy to reenactments because I don't really like candy, and I don't think that candy is so typical that I have to have it or eat it. For me, for a snack, I might bring some carrots and eat a raw carrot as a snack. I have abundant documentation in the form of memoirs of soldiers saying, we always looked for vegetables that we could put in our bread bags, or some guys would even carry a separate sack that they could have vegetables in, or that they cooked and had access to fresh vegetables. So I would rather go for something like that.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that when it comes to candy and sweets, back in the European culture of the 1940s, sweets and candy wasn't like what you ate every day. It was meant for weekends, special parties like birthday parties and stuff like that. It simply wasn't something you ate every single day.
I'll tell us a sad story from my own past, and this pertains to people. This now is an almost 20-year-old story, so basically none of the people that are involved in the story are still reenacting. But we had a guy who joined my reenactment group who was a professional. What his job was he supplied high-end cakes to hotels and conventions and banquets. So for like a black tie dinner that might be put on by a corporation, they could have an array of fancy cakes. And he was like, listen,
I didn't know Carlo was a reenactor.
Look, he said, this is insane. He was like, I could bring an array of fancy cakes to the event so that we could have a table covered with decadent luxury dessert cakes. And I said, absolutely not. This is a reenactment. We're not going to have a bunch of cakes. They didn't have that. And some other guys in the unit were like, listen, I kind of want to eat these cakes. So we put it to a unit-wide vote, and the overwhelming majority of people wanted the cakes. So for a while, we had these events where we would eat our cabbage stew or whatever, and then go over to the table at which there were these like decadent, luxurious. It was so shameful. It was one of the most shameful things. I'm like the cake. I ate the cakes. Everybody ate the cakes. They were delicious, even though I voted against it. I mean, I'm not going to eat it, but yeah, there's definitely was a reenactment embarrassment situation for sure.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, I don't know.
But when it comes to snacks that you can bring, as you said, carrots, apple, oranges. There's also some types of sweets that were rather common. One of them is actually still available in Norway at any store, already packed in a authentic neutral wax paper. And in Germany, pre-war, interwar, and during the war, lemons were abundant, and it was common to make like this lemon toffee. Chewy kind of toffee.
Sounds delicious.
Sometimes we bring that and we just hand out like a few to everyone.
That's really nice. I've done something similar where a guy in my group created like a ration plan for everyone, and it included some caramel candies of a type that had existed during World War II, and everybody got a few. And of course, some people really liked them, and other people like me, I didn't like them so much, so I traded them to other people for other food from their ration that they didn't want. So that was kind of a fun little vignette.
Yeah, but lemons, use anything that has lemons, because that was common in Germany.
That's a good. That's definitely a good tip.
But don't eat raw lemons.
I have found a bunch of tricks with lemons because I mentioned that I make this food that includes lemon juice. So I'll bring lemons to the event. This, especially if we're doing an event in a scenario where there might be fresh lemons around. So, for example, if it's like a Southern Front or Italian themed event, then I'll definitely bring lemons, and I will squeeze the juice to make that meal. I will put lemon juice in my canteen. I think it's delicious, diluted with water, of course. It's refreshing. And then I also found that like you can use like a lemon that you squeeze the juice out of kind of to wash your hands with.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
It's acidic, so.
Yeah, sure, it is. It has some acid in there. So I wouldn't want to keep it. I wouldn't want to keep it in my aluminum canteen for days. But for the day, it's fine.
Yeah. Also, lemon iced tea is something that's plausible.
Well, that brings us to, I guess, kind of the final food-related subject, which is what they drank. And I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people when they learn that German soldiers were issued coffee or tea out of the field kitchen every day. So having coffee or tea in your canteen is not only correct, but it might arguably, in many situations, be more correct than having a canteen full of water. I don't really know how German soldiers made do with the limited amount of like beverages that they had, and by beverages I mean water. You've got guys who are marching miles every day who maybe are being given a third of a liter or a half a liter of water, half a liter of liquid to consume on a daily basis. I don't really understand how it worked. And I guess sometimes I think about when I go to Germany today. So here in America, if you go to a restaurant and you order a drink, a soft drink to go with your meal, you're going to get like a great big glass with like 20 ounces of liquid in it. Whereas in Germany, the drink at the table at a restaurant is usually like a very small little thing of liquid, and you oftentimes don't even get that refilled with your meal. That's like what you have with your meal. So I don't know if it's like a cultural thing. I actually have more questions than answers about this. Like seriously, I don't know how. Like I require so much water, and I don't know if this is just because I'm used to drinking lots of liquid, and it maybe is a psychological thing, and I'm maybe not going to actually,
It's just that here in Europe, you ask for a refill.
Ask for a refill, huh?
Yeah, and I'm always amazed when I go to America because I can just take one drink and that's it. And I even have to go, like I have extra drinks to go. So
yeah, definitely different.
But I mean, when they march, they would of course get refills on their canteens, and that's I don't necessarily believe you that having coffee or tea was so common. Like of course, some people had it. Some people probably had booze in it as well. But I mean, I think it would be more common to go to a field kitchen and get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, like from your mess, from your field bottle cup, than actually filling your field bottle with it.
Well, I guess this is an opportunity that somebody has research on this. And I certainly could be wrong, but the former German soldiers that I interviewed over time, and of course this is just a tiny sample that's not necessarily representative of the millions of men, but I would ask them what they had in their canteen, and was surprised that most of them told me that they usually had coffee or tea in there. So I certainly I learned something new about, and I could be off base on that, but from my understanding, and even looking at the list of the regulation list of what soldiers were to be issued each day as a ration includes coffee or tea, and I don't think that they were actually issued coffee beans or tea bags. I believe that they were issued prepared drinks.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, but I just don't think they would, all of them, like it. I don't think it would be so common for everybody to not have water in their field bottle.
I just don't really, I guess I just struggle with trying to figure out, and maybe I'm just missing a piece of the puzzle here, but like a refill of the canteen. You know, you got food once a day and your canteen was filled at that time. And then where did your water for the rest of the day come from? That's kind of a question mark for me.
Well, water would be shuffled up to the front lines all the time. Like, I can probably believe that they would fill up their canteen in the morning with coffee, but half an hour later, when the coffee is cold, that coffee is not good, especially when you have like ersatz coffee, which is like a very horrible replacement coffee. And when that gets cold, I mean, I wouldn't even drink it if, like, even with a gun to my head.
I see. Yeah.
So I mean, they would probably drink of it while it was hot and pour it out, then get water in it.
How would they have brought the water up to the front? I mean, I don't even know. I guess it could have been in a variety of. Certainly speculate about it, but I don't know. The documentation seems scarce, and maybe in the future I'll be able to find some more solid information on this.
Well, from what I understand, you had like several different sizes of water tanks the Germans had, and one of the ones that were closest to the front line were a 900-liter tank, and they would go to like a huge water depot and just get refill and then shuffle back to the front line, and then you would basically have one guy or a couple of guys who took all the field bottles from their squad or unit or whatever, and they would go to these water depots to fill them up. And usually they would have an attachment onto these tanks where you could just hang the water bottle under them, and you could refill 10 water bottles at a time.
That's really cool.
And also field kitchens, also like every field kitchen has also a like a water tank built into them, and they also had a little piece of equipment which you could fill up easily from that to one water bottle worth of water, and then pour that easily into your water bottle.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Another thing I'll say is looking at when German bunkers on the former Eastern Front get dug up, or their trash pits get dug up, there's like bottles in there a lot. And some of them are beer bottles, but some of them are bottles from mineral water or other types of soft drinks. So, and even to some extent, there are sometimes like soda bottles that get found. And I don't ever drink soda at a reenactment, or it's like hiding somewhere in shame. And I'm not pretending that it's something that's realistic. But
I mean, in a bunker, I can see like soda bottles being around. But put a glass soda bottle in your pocket and run around and then open it.
Right.
If it's even in one piece.
As far as like beer goes, they didn't have like a daily beer ration. They definitely didn't have cans of beer. We could probably do a 10-hour episode about the follies of drinking alcohol and the intersection of that with reenacting. But I guess my thought is, if you want to bring beer, if you feel like you have to bring beer, or if you're doing a scenario where the beer maybe is appropriate, I'll just strip the labels off bottles of beer and just bring it just like that. I try to find something that has a cap that has kind of a neutral looking emblem on there, or a bear cap if I can, and then I'll just soak the labels off the bottles and I'll bring that.
That's what we often do as well.
I do the same thing with bottles of hard liquor. I've tried making replica labels for these bottles with like limited success, and there's a couple of reasons for that. And just one of the reasons is that the printing presses that were used to make the labels for beverage bottles back then, it yielded a different look than what you can get with a printer at home.
You can buy good reproduction labels from a place called Atlas Repo Paper.
Yeah, maybe we should put a link to Atlas in the show notes. They have a whole variety of different packaging that is great stuff. But yeah, I think it's great if people go the extra mile to obtain realistic looking labels for their bottles. And I've done it a little bit, but like I say, most of the time I'll just strip the label off, which isn't wrong. Usually, when there were bottles during World War II that didn't have a label, they had manufacturer information impressed into the glass, but not always. And I don't think it's technically wrong just to have just a plain bottle with whatever content.
Yeah, I mean it's from an authentic standpoint, it's both safe and easy.
I agree. So, what else? Was there anything else that you wanted to add on the topic of food? I guess I should just say I'll throw in really briefly, like cooking over a fire is not that hard at all once you get some experience doing it. We have like a grate from an old 1920s era cast iron stove that I sometimes use as a sort of a cooking grate to balance my pot on, although other times I'll just sort of balance it on rocks, which is something that definitely happened during World War II. And I guess that rounds out what I had to on the food topic.
You also had the Aspit, the small foldable stove many use.
I love using my...
Yeah, I use mine constantly, and I've made many meals on it. I'll become quite a Aspit expert. But it is not necessary to have one. Not everybody had it either. But on the topic of a fireplace, sometimes when it gets dark, there may be some restrictions on using light on the front line. And then the Aspit can be used instead discreetly.
Sure. I like the Aspit stove. There's been some discussion about whether or not Aspit stoves are overused, because of course not everybody had an Aspit stove, and then the fuel is you have a limited amount of fuel, and then once you use up the fuel, where do you get additional fuel tablets from?
I've used twigs in my Aspit.
That's cool. That's really cool. Then you are an Aspit expert, and I'm sure that's something that they must have done as well. Is build a tiny little wood fueled fire inside this little tiny stove. I really like using mine too. I think they're extremely zony, and I much prefer the Aspit stove to the Joule like White Spirit cooker stove that also existed and was issued on some level during World War II. I like the Aspit.
Yeah, I agree. Also, in terms of tablets, one problem I see many do is they put on 3 or 4 tablets at a time. The trick is just to use 1 and 1, because when you put on more, it doesn't get warmer. The flame doesn't really get any bigger. You're just spending your tablets at 3 times the pace.
I have the exact same experience, and I learned that kind of the hard too, is that two tablets don't really make any more heat than one tablet. It's the length of time that you want to do one tablet, and then with that one's burning out, I'll put the other one.
Exactly.
I've made all kinds of food with the Aspit stove. I think they're really handy little things, and they're still made today. They're different. They're a little different today than the Wehrmacht ones were, and unfortunately, the Wehrmacht model seems to have been discontinued in 1945. So, you can either use an original or use a post-war one that's a little bit different. I choose to use the post-war one. I think that the little differences don't actually affect the function. It still looks mostly the same, and I personally would just feel terrible using an original stove. The stove that I use was brand new when I started using it, and now it looks like it was ground dug relic from Siberia, because I've used it so much, and I just would hate to destroy an original thing that way.
Yeah, exactly. But then again, Aspit still, and back then also, made stoves, like many different models of stoves for hikers. And so there's many pre-war models that were made long after World War II that are still as viable as the Wehrmacht model.
Cool. Yeah,
not necessarily as an issue one, but as a private purchase one.
I've used a few different kinds. I have some Czech military surplus ones and some East German ones that have similarities and different to the Wehrmacht one. This is kind of an example. This is kind of an example of a thing where, to me, the function of the thing is a little bit more important than the exact form. So I think it's realistic to have and use these things, even if the exact design elements aren't all present at the same time.
I agree.
I guess we could probably wrap it up, Lasse. I think I don't know how long this has been, but I think we covered everything that we wanted to go over.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this has been a great episode.
Yeah, and I'm excited for the next one already. We got a lot to think about for the next episode that we're going to do.
Yeah, and the next episode will be released in 2 weeks on the 18th of July. Woo.
Great. Now, one other thing we need to tell people is that we have created a new section as of today on the Soldatenforum.com reenactment discussion forum that is just for this podcast. So we would love to hear feedback from people, and that is going to be the best place to do it. You can log on to Soldatenforum, and there's going to be a separate thread in the podcast section for every episode of the show that we do. And in that thread, there will be a link to the episode, and you can comment on it. You can talk about what you liked, what you didn't like. You can ask questions, make corrections if I said something that was totally wrong. Whatever you want, you can interact with us on there. And of course, we'll be checking it, and we can respond to that stuff and maybe even address corrections or concerns in future episodes as well.
Absolutely. That's what it's for.
Yeah, so we should put a link to that in the show notes too. I know we've talked about Soldatenforum before. I think most of our listeners probably know what we're talking about, but for anybody who doesn't, there'll be a link in there.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, definitely tell us what you think. I want to hear from you listeners. And of course, ideas for future episodes, whatever you want to tell us, you can post on there, and I'll be all ears. I'd love to hear it, positive or negative.
But we don't really like negative ones, so please focus on the positive.
Well, I'll never improve. I mean, I think that,
Yeah. So just get in touch on the Soldatenforum.com. We're on that forum hopefully every day.
Hopefully.
Not when we're at events.
Hopefully not when we're at events. All right, guys. Well, on that note, thanks for listening. And Lasse, it's been great talking to you, and I'll talk to you next time.
Yeah. See you in the field, Chris.
See you in the field.